The late winter wind carved through the valley like a blade, rattling the bare branches of ancient oaks that lined the approach to Thornwood Estate, and Lady Charlotte Ainsworth felt each gust as a whisper of warning against her gloved hands, her chest, her carefully composed face, pressed near the carriage window. The great house emerged from the grey afternoon like something conjured from stone and shadow, 3 stories of weathered granite, wings extending east and west, as though the building itself sought to embrace or imprison all who entered, windows dark and watching, chimneys exhaling thin threads of smoke into the colourless sky. Asterisk, "This is to be my home, asterisk," she thought, and the words felt foreign in her mind, a sentence pronounced rather than chosen, duty dressed in the language of destiny. She had known, of course, that her marriage to the Duke of Thornwood was a matter of arrangement, of families aligning interests as they had done for centuries, of her father's estate securing connection to Sebastian Thornwood's greater title and wealth. Yet some small, foolish corner of her heart had harbored hope that perhaps there might be something more than obligation waiting for her beyond these iron gates. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel, the sound sharp and final, and as the footman handed her down onto the drive, Charlotte lifted her chin and straightened her travelling cloak, willing herself to appear serene, dignified, ready. The massive oak doors opened, and there he stood, the Duke, her husband-to-be, tall and dark-haired, his features carved with the same severe beauty as his ancestral home, his grey eyes meeting hers for one brief, assessing moment before sliding away as though she were merely another piece of furniture being delivered to his household. "Lady Charlotte," he said, his voice low and without warmth, a perfunctory acknowledgement that required no response. "Your Grace," she replied, curtsying with practiced grace, and when she rose, he had already turned away, murmuring something to the butler about her rooms being prepared, about the ceremony scheduled for tomorrow, about matters of no consequence delivered in that same cold, distant tone. The wedding itself passed like a dream, experienced through frosted glass, the chapel filled with faces she barely knew, Sebastian's hand cold and impersonal as he slipped the ring onto her finger, his lips brushing her cheek in a kiss that held no more passion than a signature on a contract. The breakfast that followed, where he sat at the far end of the long table and spoke only when necessity demanded it. As evening descended and the last guests departed, Charlotte found herself alone in her chambers, the Duchess's chambers now, silk wallpaper and gilded mirrors surrounding her like beautiful, indifferent witnesses, and somewhere in the distant west wing she knew her husband had retreated to his study, placing doors and corridors and the vast cold space of their arrangement between them, and she wondered, as she unpinned her bridal veil with trembling fingers, whether she had just entered a marriage or a mausoleum, whether the man who could not meet her eyes would ever truly see her at all. Spring arrived at Thornwood with reluctant grace, the frost retreating from the gardens in slow surrender, crocuses pushing through the dark earth like small acts of defiance against the lingering cold, and Charlotte watched the transformation from her bedroom window each morning, wondering if the thaw outside would ever penetrate the walls of her marriage. She had determined, in those first weeks after the wedding, to fulfill her role as Duchess with all the dignity and competence expected of her station, and so she rose early each day, consulted with Mrs. Ashford, the housekeeper, about menus and household accounts, walked the gardens, making notes about plantings and repairs, reviewed the estate ledgers that Sebastian's steward brought to her with apologetic deference, and took her meals in the vast dining room where her solitary place-setting seemed to mock the dozens of empty chairs surrounding her. Sebastian remained a ghost in his own house, a presence she tracked through secondary evidence, his study door closed, his boots by the servants' entrance covered in mud from riding the estate borders, his untouched breakfast tray returned to the kitchen because he had left at dawn without eating, his voice heard distantly giving instructions to the land agent or the stable master. Always occupied, always elsewhere, always beyond her reach. Asterisk. This is my life now, asterisk, she told herself, as she directed the maids in airing out the morning room, as she wrote letters to her mother, assuring her that all was well, as she sat with needlework in the evening, with only the clocks ticking for company, and she tried to find satisfaction in duty, in the small improvements she was making to the household routines, in the respect she saw growing in the servants' eyes as they recognized her competence and gentle authority. Yet duty, she discovered, was cold comfort when one lay awake at night listening to the house settle and creak, knowing that somewhere in the distant west wing her husband sat in his study or slept in his bachelor's chambers, as separate from her as if they had never spoken vows at all, as if her presence at Thornwood were merely administrative rather than intimate, as if she were the Duchess in name only and nothing more. She caught glimpses of him, sometimes crossing the entrance hall as she descended the stairs, his dark head bent over correspondence, his profile severe and beautiful in the lamplight, standing by the morning-room window staring out at the rain, his shoulders rigid with some tension she could not name, riding back from the tenant farms at dusk, his horse's hooves loud on the gravel, his face weary in a way that spoke of more than physical exhaustion. Once, in the third week of her residence, he appeared at dinner, taking his place at the head of the table, while she sat in her customary seat halfway down its length, and the servants moved with silent efficiency through the courses, while the distance between them filled with all the words neither spoke. "The estate accounts are in excellent order," he said finally, his voice formal, his eyes on his wine-glass rather than her face. "You have a talent for management." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, the title bitter on her tongue, a reminder that they were Duke and Duchess, not Sebastian and Charlotte, not husband and wife in any true sense. "I wish to be useful." "You are," he said, and something in his tone made her look up sharply, but his expression remained shuttered, unreadable. And after another moment of suffocating silence, he rose, bowed slightly, and left her alone with the remainder of her meal growing cold on fine china. And she understood then that spring had come to Thornwood, but not, it seemed, to her marriage. And she wondered, with an ache that settled deep in her chest, whether she would spend all her seasons here, as she had spent her winter waiting, hoping, and perpetually, achingly alone. The morning Charlotte decided to stop waiting for her marriage to begin, and instead build a life within its constraints. The sky hung low and grey with spring rain, and she stood in the estate office with maps of the tenant farms spread before her, her finger tracing the boundaries of lives that depended on Thornwood's prosperity, on her competence, on her willingness to care even when she herself felt uncared for. She would make the best of this, she resolved, with a fierce determination that surprised her with its strength. If Sebastian would not be her husband in truth, then she would be the best duchess these lands had ever known, would pour all her unspent affection and energy into the gardens and tenants and halls of this great cold house, until it reflected something of the warmth she carried within her, until she could look at herself in the mirror and see purpose rather than pity. The rose garden became her first project, that neglected quarter-acre behind the east wing, where her predecessor, Sebastian's mother, dead these 10 years, had once cultivated hundreds of varieties, now overgrown with weeds and wild vines, the trellises collapsing, and Charlotte spent her afternoons there with the head gardener, planning the restoration, ordering new plants from London, getting dirt under her fingernails as she helped clear the beds, finding in the physical labor a release for the restlessness that plagued her during the long, empty evenings. She visited the tenant families, riding out in the estate cart with baskets of provisions, learning their names and their children's names, sitting in their modest kitchens to hear their concerns about leaking roofs and sick livestock, taking notes in her careful script and ensuring that repairs were made, that the estate steward understood these were not requests but requirements. And slowly she saw surprise turn to respect, wariness turn to welcome, and she understood that even if she could not win her husband's attention, she could earn these people's loyalty, and perhaps that would be enough. Mrs. Ashford, the elderly housekeeper who had served at Thornwood for 40 years, became her unexpected confidant, the older woman's shrewd eyes seeing past Charlotte's composed facade to the loneliness beneath, and they took tea together in the housekeeper's sitting room, where Charlotte could drop her duchess's mask and simply be a young woman trying to understand her place in this vast, indifferent house. And Mrs. Ashford's dry wisdom and steady presence became an anchor in Charlotte's unmoored days. Sebastian noticed. She knew he did. She caught him once standing in the doorway of the morning room, watching her review household accounts with the butler, his expression unreadable before he turned away, and another time she saw him at his study window, overlooking the rose garden, where she knelt in the dirt. And though he never spoke of these observations, never acknowledged her efforts, the estate steward mentioned that His Grace had approved every improvement she requested without question, had even added funds to her household budget, and she understood that this was perhaps the only language he knew how to speak. This silent provision, this distant approval that felt like scraps thrown to a starving woman who had hoped for a feast. The day she planted the new roses, delicate pink climbers that would take years to establish. To bloom in their full glory, she knelt in the prepared bed and pressed each root ball into the earth with hands that trembled slightly, thinking that she might never see these flowers reach maturity, that she might not remain at Thornwood long enough to witness the fruit of her labor. Yet she planted them anyway because hope, she discovered, was not always about certainty but about the willingness to invest in a future that might never be yours. And as she patted the soil around the final plant, she felt the weight of her isolation settle over her like a cloak, the understanding that she was surrounded by people, servants, tenants, even the silent presence of her husband, yet remained profoundly, devastatingly alone, and she wondered whether a person could survive on purpose when what they truly craved was love, whether duty could sustain a heart that longed for something duty could never provide, whether the roses would bloom for a duchess who had everything except the one thing that mattered most. Summer descended upon Thornwood like a lover's embrace, transforming the estate into something almost magical. The gardens erupted in cascades of color, the fountains sang with crystal water, the very air seemed to shimmer with warmth and possibility, and Charlotte found herself moving through this beauty with an ache that had nothing to do with the season's heat, and everything to do with the man who remained as distant as winter, even as June blazed around them. The garden party had been Mrs. Ashford's suggestion, a reminder that society expected the Duchess of Thornwood to fulfill certain obligations, and Charlotte had thrown herself into the preparations with the same determined energy she brought to all her duties. Overseeing the placement of tables on the south lawn, the arrangement of refreshments, the hiring of musicians, telling herself that this was simply another responsibility and not at all an attempt to draw Sebastian's attention, to make him see her as something more than the competent administrator of his household. The day arrived perfect and golden, and Charlotte stood in the receiving line wearing a gown of pale blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes, greeting the neighboring gentry with practiced grace, while remaining hyper-aware of Sebastian beside her, formally dressed, perfectly polite, present in body but absent in every way that mattered, his hand touching hers only when protocol demanded it, his conversation limited to the bare minimum required by courtesy. She watched him move through the party like a figure in a painting, beautiful, unreachable, separate, and something in her chest twisted painfully at the sight of him, laughing at something Lord Pembridge said, at the ease he showed with everyone except her, at the realization that he was capable of warmth, but chose not to offer it in her direction. Mr. Edmund Hartley arrived late, a distant cousin of the Pembridge family whom Charlotte remembered vaguely from her London season, and he sought her out with flattering persistence, bringing her lemonade, commenting on the beauty of the gardens she had restored, asking about her roses with genuine interest, and Charlotte found herself responding with more animation than she had felt in weeks, grateful for this simple evidence that she was still visible, still interesting, still worthy of someone's attention. She did not notice Sebastian's gaze following her as she walked with Mr. Hartley through the rose garden, did not see the way his hand tightened on his glass when Hartley made her laugh, did not observe the muscle working in his jaw when Hartley bent close to examine a bloom she indicated, but Mrs. Ashford noticed, and the housekeeper's shrewd eyes moved between the Duke's barely contained tension and the Duchess's animated conversation with something like satisfaction mixed with concern. When Sebastian appeared suddenly at Charlotte's elbow, his voice cool as he suggested she attend to the other guests, Mr. Hartley graciously withdrew, but not before securing Charlotte's promise to correspond with him about botanical matters, and as she watched him go, Charlotte became aware of Sebastian's presence beside her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, made her breath catch, made her turn to find him staring not at the departing guest but at her, something indefinable flickering in his dark eyes before he shuttered it away. "You are needed by the refreshment tables," he said, his voice perfectly neutral, perfectly controlled, but there was something beneath it, something that made her pulse quicken even as frustration flared hot in her chest. "I am always needed somewhere, Your Grace," she replied, and she heard the bitterness in her own voice, saw his slight flinch before he turned away, and as she moved back toward her duties, Charlotte felt the full weight of Summer's cruelty, surrounded by warmth and beauty and life. She remained frozen in a marriage as cold as January, and the terrible truth she had been avoiding crystallized in that moment with devastating clarity. She had fallen in love with her husband, had somehow given her heart to the man who barely acknowledged her existence, and the longing that filled her as she watched him disappear into the house was sharp enough to make her gasp, bright enough to illuminate just how desperately, hopelessly trapped she had become in loving someone who had made it abundantly clear he would never, could never, love her in return. The fever came with the summer storm, lightning splitting the sky as Charlotte's body burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the season, and she lay in her vast bed feeling small and frightened in a way she had not allowed herself to feel since arriving at Thornwood, her carefully constructed composure dissolved by delirium, calling out in her fever dreams for her mother, for home, for someone to hold her hand through the darkness that kept threatening to pull her under. The physician came and went with his useless bleedings and his grave pronouncements about humours and rest, and Mrs. Ashford stationed herself in the sick room with fierce maternal determination, pressing cool cloths to Charlotte's burning forehead, coaxing spoonfuls of broth past cracked lips, murmuring reassurances that Charlotte heard through the fog of fever as fragments of comfort in an ocean of confusion. Sebastian did not come, of course, he did not come, and yet Charlotte sensed his presence somehow, felt it like a change in air pressure, like the moment before lightning strikes, and in her more lucid moments, she thought she heard his voice in the corridor beyond her door, low and tense, demanding updates from the physician, though surely that was merely another fever dream, another manifestation of her desperate longing for something he had never offered and never would. 3 days the fever raged, and on the third night when it finally broke, Charlotte woke to find the room dark except for a single candle, Mrs. Ashford dozing in the chair beside her bed, and she felt hollowed out, fragile as spun glass, as though the illness had burned away everything except the essential core of herself, leaving her raw and exposed and strangely clear-sighted about the impossibility of her situation. Mrs. Ashford woke to find Charlotte watching her, and something in the older woman's expression, relief, mixed with a curious satisfaction, made Charlotte ask in her hoarse, ruined voice whether anyone had inquired after her, and the housekeeper's response came carefully, too carefully. "His Grace has been most concerned, my lady," and when Charlotte pressed, the truth emerged like water from a reluctant well. Sebastian had spent each night of her illness in the corridor outside her door, sleeping in a chair when exhaustion claimed him, refusing to leave his post, his face drawn with an anguish he never allowed Charlotte to see, and the housekeeper's revelation struck Charlotte with the force of a physical blow, because what kind of man maintained such distance, yet could not bring himself to leave her side in illness? What kind of prison was this, where the walls were made not of stone, but of his inexplicable refusal to acknowledge what his actions so clearly demonstrated? When Charlotte was strong enough to leave her bed, she went to him, found him in his study amid the familiar fortress of ledgers and correspondence, and she stood in the doorway until he looked up, and she watched something flicker across his face, relief, fear, something unnamed, and quickly suppressed before his customary mask descended. "I am told you kept vigil outside my door," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, harder, because the fever had burned away her patience, along with everything else. "I am told you could not sleep while I was ill, yet you could not bring yourself to sit beside my bed, to offer comfort, to be present as a husband should be present." He stood, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "You were well attended by Mrs. Ashford and the physician," he said, and his voice was carefully neutral, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the whiteness of his knuckles. "I would only have been in the way." "In the way," Charlotte repeated, and she laughed, a bitter sound that made him flinch. "You are my husband, Sebastian. Your place was at my side, and instead you lurked in corridors like a ghost, haunting his own house." She moved closer, emboldened by weakness, by the clarity that comes from facing mortality even in its mildest form. "I need to understand, do you despise me? Is my presence so repellent that you cannot bear even to be in the same room? Because if that is the case, then tell me plainly, and I will release you from this burden." For a long moment he said nothing, and she watched something like agony move behind his eyes before he mastered it. "I do not despise you," he said, and his voice was rough, almost broken. "I have never despised you. "Then what?" she demanded, and she was horrified to feel tears threatening, weakness she could not afford. "What am I to you? Why did you marry me if you intended to treat me as nothing more than a competent housekeeper?" "You do not understand," he said, and he turned away from her, presenting his back as he always did when confronted with anything requiring emotional honesty. "You cannot understand." "Then make me understand," Charlotte said, but he remained silent, rigid, and after a moment she turned and left him standing among his carefully ordered papers, and as she walked back to her chambers through corridors that felt more like a mausoleum than a home, she understood with devastating certainty that something had shifted during her illness. The fever had burned away, her willingness to accept crumbs had crystallized her understanding that she deserved more than this half-life, and though she did not yet know what she would do with this knowledge, she felt it settling in her bones like a promise, like a threat, like the first whisper of transformation that would require far more courage than she had yet been called upon to demonstrate. Autumn arrived at Thornwood with the slow inevitability of transformation, the leaves turning gold and crimson as though the trees themselves were bleeding out the last warmth of summer, and Charlotte watched the season change from her bedroom window with something like recognition settling in her chest. She too was changing, hardening perhaps, or maybe simply accepting what she had spent months refusing to acknowledge, that this marriage would never be what she had hoped, that Sebastian would never be anything more than a distant stranger who shared her name but not her life, and it was time to consider what remained of her future if she stopped waiting for something that would never come. The letter arrived on a morning thick with mist, her mother's careful script on cream paper, suggesting with elaborate casualness that perhaps Charlotte might enjoy a visit home, that her old room remained exactly as she had left it, that the family missed her presence terribly, and though the words were gentle, Charlotte understood the subtext. Her family had heard rumors of her unhappy marriage, had perhaps even expected it given Sebastian's reputation, and were offering her an escape wrapped in the guise of a visit, a way to leave Thornwood without admitting defeat, to return to the safety of her childhood home and the possibility of a different life entirely. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time, watching the mist curl through the gardens she had restored, the roses she had planted now heavy with autumn blooms, and she felt pulled in two directions, the stubborn part of her that refused to admit failure, that had invested so much hope and effort into making Thornwood beautiful, and the exhausted part that whispered she had given enough, tried enough, suffered enough in loving a man who could not or would not love her in return. That afternoon she sought out Mrs. Ashford in the housekeeper's sitting room, needing to speak the possibility aloud to make it real, and the older woman listened with her characteristic quiet attention as Charlotte explained about the letter, about her family's invitation, about the terrible temptation to simply leave and never return to this beautiful prison where she had slowly been suffocating beneath the weight of Sebastian's determined indifference. "I do not know if I can continue this way," Charlotte said, and her voice broke on the words, months of accumulated pain finally finding expression. "I have tried everything, been patient beyond measure, and he remains as distant as the day I arrived. Perhaps it would be better for both of us if I simply admitted this was a mistake and returned home." Mrs. Ashford reached across and took Charlotte's hand, her grip warm and firm. "You must do what is best for your own heart, my lady," she said gently. "No one would fault you for choosing your own happiness." They did not hear Sebastian pass in the corridor beyond, did not see him freeze at the sound of Charlotte's voice discussing departure, did not observe the way his hand pressed against the wall as though he needed support, the color draining from his face as he stood there listening to his wife plan to leave him, and for the first time since Charlotte had arrived at Thornwood, Sebastian felt something crack in the carefully constructed fortress around his heart. Not the slow erosion he had been fighting for months, but a sudden, devastating fracture because the possibility of her absence, of Thornwood without her presence, of his life returning to the empty existence he had maintained before she arrived, struck him with a terror so profound it made him understand with shocking clarity that he had been lying to himself, that his distance had been protection not against caring, but against the magnitude of how much he already cared. And as he stood frozen in that corridor, listening to her speak of leaving, Sebastian was forced to confront what he had spent months denying, that somewhere between her arrival and this autumn morning she had become essential, that the thought of losing her was unbearable, and that the walls he had built to protect himself had instead become the very thing that would destroy him, because she was going to leave, and it would be entirely his fault, and he did not know if he possessed the courage necessary to prevent it, or if pride and fear would claim one more victim in the long history of Thornwood's cursed, cold-hearted dukes. Mrs. Ashford found Charlotte in the library the next morning, sitting among the leather-bound volumes that Sebastian had collected over generations, and the older woman carried with her the weight of decision in her expression, the look of someone who has spent a sleepless night wrestling with loyalty and conscience and has finally chosen a side. "There are things you should know, my lady," she said quietly, closing the door behind her with careful deliberation. "Things about His Grace that might help you understand why he is as he is, though understanding does not require forgiveness, and you must make your own choice about what you can bear." And so Charlotte learned what Sebastian had never told her, the history that had shaped him into the distant, damaged man who had married her while keeping his heart locked behind walls of his own construction. How there had been a woman, when Sebastian was 23, a beautiful, charming creature named Eleanor Fitzroy, who had seemed to love him with passionate intensity, who had spoken of forever and devotion, and how Sebastian, young enough to still believe in such things, had loved her with the wholehearted abandon of someone who had never yet been betrayed. Mrs. Ashford spoke of how Eleanor had accepted Sebastian's proposal, how the wedding had been planned, how Sebastian had walked through Thornwood making preparations with a joy the household had never witnessed before or since, and then how, 3 weeks before the wedding, he had discovered Eleanor in the garden folded into the embrace of another man, had learned that her affection had been performance, that she had been conducting an affair throughout their entire courtship, that she had intended to marry Sebastian for his title and fortune while maintaining her lover on the side. And the housekeeper's voice roughened as she described how something had broken in Sebastian that day, how he had withdrawn into himself, how the light had gone out of him and never fully returned. "But that was only part of the story, Mrs. Ashford continued, because Sebastian's wounds went deeper than romantic betrayal. His own parents' marriage had been a cautionary tale written in bitterness and regret, his father a cold, cruel man who had married Sebastian's mother for her dowry and then made her life a systematic misery, criticizing her, isolating her, until she had faded like a flower denied sunlight, dying when Sebastian was only 15, and the young Duke had watched his mother waste away in a marriage that was nothing more than a beautiful prison. He vowed he would never repeat his father's mistakes. Mrs. Ashford said, her hands twisting in her apron, vowed he would never marry, and when circumstances and duty forced him to seek a wife, he convinced himself that distance was kindness, that if he kept you at arm's length, he could not hurt you the way his father hurt his mother, could not become the monster he feared lived somewhere inside him. Charlotte sat very still, feeling the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves into a picture that was no less painful, but at least made terrible sense. Sebastian had not been indifferent but terrified, not cold but protecting her from what he believed he might become, and his cruelty had been a twisted form of care, the only kind he could allow himself to offer. "He watches you," Mrs. Ashford added softly, "when you walk in the gardens, when you sit at dinner, when you move through the house making everything beautiful. He watches you with such longing, my lady, such desperate hunger for something he believes he does not deserve, and he is slowly destroying himself trying to protect you from a danger that exists only in his damaged imagination." Charlotte felt tears sliding down her cheeks as understanding and anger warred within her, because she could see now the shape of Sebastian's prison, could understand the fear that drove him, but understanding did not erase the months of loneliness, did not heal the wounds his distance had inflicted, and she found herself caught between compassion for his pain and fury at his cowardice, because however damaged he might be, he had made her suffer for sins that were not her own, had punished them both for crimes committed by others, and she did not know if knowing his history changed anything at all, or if it simply made the tragedy more complete. Two people who might have loved each other kept apart by ghosts and fear and the terrible certainty that sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very thing that destroys us. The hunting party arrived at Thornwood on a crisp October morning, when the estate grounds blazed with autumn color, and Charlotte found herself thrust into the role she had been trained for since childhood, the gracious hostess presiding over a gathering of aristocrats who came as much to observe the famously cold Duke of Thornwood and his new Duchess as to pursue game through the forests, and she rose to the occasion with a poise that came from equal parts breeding and desperation, determined that whatever private misery defined her marriage, she would not give society the satisfaction of witnessing her failure. She wore amber silk that brought out the gold in her hair and stood in the entrance hall, welcoming guests with warmth that felt like armor. And she did not look at Sebastian standing beside her, did not acknowledge the way his presence made her skin prickle with awareness, did not let herself hope that the formal touch of his hand at her elbow meant anything more than propriety demanded. The guests arrived in a flurry of carriages and servants and luggage, filling Thornwood's empty rooms with noise and life, and Charlotte moved through the chaos with effortless efficiency, ensuring everyone was settled and comfortable, and she felt, rather than saw Sebastian watching her, felt his gaze following her movements with an intensity she did not understand and could not afford to interpret as anything other than a host's general oversight of his household. Among the guests was Lord Edmund Ashworth, a gentleman from Charlotte's past who had once paid court to her before her family had arranged the more advantageous match with Sebastian, and the moment Edmund stepped into the entrance hall, his face lit with unguarded pleasure at seeing her, and he took her hand with a familiarity that made something dangerous flash in Sebastian's carefully controlled expression. "Lady Charlotte," Edmund said warmly, "or I should say, Your Grace, how radiant you look, how well Thornwood clearly agrees with you," and his words were honey-sweet, with affection that had apparently survived both rejection and her marriage to another man, and Charlotte felt herself responding to his kindness like a flower turning towards sunlight after months in shadow, because here was someone who looked at her with open admiration, who smiled at her without restraint, who treated her as though she were precious, rather than an obligation to be endured. The first evening's dinner was an elaborate affair with 20 guests seated along Thornwood's massive table, candlelight glittering off crystal and silver, and Charlotte presided from her end with grace, while Sebastian sat at his distant position, watching her charm their guests with conversation that flowed as easily as the wine. And she felt his attention, like a weight, looked up once to find him staring at her with an expression she could not read, something hungry and desperate and almost angry, before he turned to answer some question from the lady beside him and reached for his wine glass with a hand that was not entirely steady. Edmund sat near Charlotte and kept her engaged in conversation throughout the meal, reminiscing about London seasons and mutual acquaintances, making her laugh with gentle wit, and she found herself grateful for his presence, for this reminder that she was capable of connection, that not every man found her company a burden to be avoided, and she did not notice how Sebastian's consumption of wine steadily increased as the evening progressed, how his responses to those around him became increasingly curt, how his knuckles whitened around the stem of his glass each time Edmund leaned close to whisper something that made Charlotte smile. After dinner, the party moved to the drawing room for music and cards, and Edmund remained at Charlotte's side with the devotion of a man who had been given a second chance at proximity to something he had lost, and Sebastian stood by the window, ostensibly in conversation with other gentlemen, but actually watching his wife and her former suitor with barely contained tension that made Mrs. Ashford exchange worried glances with the butler, because everyone who knew Sebastian could see that something was building in him, some pressure increasing behind the dam of his legendary control, and the housekeeper recognized the signs of a man being pushed toward a breaking point he had spent months carefully avoiding, watching the woman he loved, though he had never admitted it, even to himself, receive from another man the warmth and attention he had been too afraid to offer. The evening air had grown cool enough that Charlotte wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she stood in the garden with Edmund, who had followed her outside after she'd excused herself from the drawing room's stifling atmosphere, needing air and space, and a moment away from Sebastian's burning gaze that had tracked her movements all evening with an intensity that made her skin flush and her heart race with emotions she could not afford to name. And Edmund was telling her some amusing story about a mutual acquaintance in London, his presence comfortable and undemanding, and she was laughing at his wit when she heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up to find Sebastian approaching through the moonlight like an avenging angel, his face a mask of barely contained fury, his movements predatory and wrong, and before she could speak, He had positioned himself between her and Edmund with the territorial aggression of a man who had finally been pushed beyond the limits of his legendary control. "Lord Ashworth," Sebastian said, and his voice was silk over steel, dangerous and cold and thrumming with something violent underneath. "I believe you have monopolized my wife's attention quite sufficiently for one evening. Perhaps you might seek entertainment elsewhere." Edmund straightened, clearly taken aback by the hostility radiating from his host, and Charlotte felt anger spark hot in her chest because Sebastian had no right at all, to act the possessive husband when he had spent months treating her like an unwanted piece of furniture, and she stepped forward with her chin raised in challenge. "Lord Ashworth is my guest, Your Grace," she said coolly, "and he has been kind enough to provide the conversation and companionship that I apparently cannot expect from my own husband." Something flickered in Sebastian's eyes, pain or rage or both, and he turned to Edmund with a look that would have frozen fire. "Leave us," he commanded, no longer bothering with even the pretense of civility. "Leave us now, and if you value your continued welcome at Thornwood, you will keep your distance from the Duchess henceforth." Edmund looked to Charlotte uncertainly, clearly unwilling to abandon her but also aware that he was treading on dangerous ground, and she nodded slightly, releasing him from the awkward situation though her hands trembled with fury. And once Edmund had retreated toward the house with several backward glances, Charlotte rounded on Sebastian with all the rage and hurt and loneliness of the past months boiling over into something she could no longer contain. "How dare you?" she breathed, her voice shaking. "How dare you act the jealous husband when you have done everything in your power to make it clear that you want nothing to do with me, when you have avoided me, ignored me, treated me as though my presence in your home was an inconvenience to be endured rather than a marriage to be honored?" Sebastian's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping beneath his skin, and she could see him fighting for control, fighting to rebuild the walls that had cracked under the pressure of watching her with another man. "You are my wife," he said roughly, and the words sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside him. "Mine, Charlotte, and I will not stand by while another man then act as my husband," she interrupted, her voice rising, months of pain pouring out in a torrent she could no longer dam. "Be my husband, Sebastian. Be something other than a cold stranger who shares nothing but a name and a roof. Because I will not continue in this half-life where I am married but utterly alone, where I watch you from across empty rooms and wonder what crime I committed that made you hate me so thoroughly." "I don't hate you," he said, and his voice cracked on the words, and for a moment she saw something raw and desperate in his face before he turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension, and when he spoke again his voice was carefully controlled, emptied of emotion, the walls rebuilt. "I don't hate you, Charlotte, but I cannot. This conversation is pointless." And he walked away, left her standing in the moonlight with tears streaming down her face and her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood from her palms, and she realized they were both shaking, both destroyed, both trapped in a marriage that was slowly killing them one silent day at a time. The first snow fell 3 days after the confrontation in the garden, arriving early even for the North Country, and Charlotte stood at her chamber window, watching the white flakes settle over Thornwood's grounds like a shroud, transforming the estate back into the cold, forbidding fortress it had been when she first arrived, and she thought how fitting it was that winter should return now, how appropriate that the season of death and dormancy should mirror the final death of whatever fragile hope she had still harbored for her marriage, because after that night in the garden when Sebastian had walked away from her again, leaving her with half confessions and no answers, she had finally accepted what she should have known from the beginning, that some things were too broken to mend, that some walls were built too high to scale, that some men were too damaged to risk loving. She had written to her mother the morning after the hunting party ended, after the guests had departed and Thornwood had returned to its customary silence, a careful letter that revealed nothing of her devastation, but mentioned how she missed her family and wondered if she might visit for the new year. And her mother's response had arrived within the week, warm and understanding. In that way mothers have of reading what is not written, suggesting that Charlotte come home for Christmas and stay as long as she wished. And Charlotte had held that letter like a lifeline while she made her decision, while she acknowledged that leaving would be admitting defeat, but staying would be accepting a living death, and she chose survival over pride, chose life over the slow starvation of her spirit that continuing at Thornwood would demand. She began her preparations in secret, instructing her maid Mary to pack her belongings gradually so as not to attract notice, sorting through her possessions and deciding what belonged to the Duchess of Thornwood and what belonged to Charlotte Ainsworth, for she was becoming Charlotte Ainsworth again in her mind, shedding the identity that had never quite fit, the role she had tried so desperately to fill for a man who did not want her filling it, and she moved through her days with careful composure, maintaining the routines and responsibilities of Mistress of Thornwood, while knowing each action might be among her last in this place that had never become home. Sebastian had disappeared even more thoroughly than before, and the staff whispered that he spent his days riding through the snow-covered estate until his horse was exhausted and his nights in his study, with only brandy for company. And Mrs. Ashford came to Charlotte's sitting room one grey afternoon, with concern etched deep in her weathered face, and said, "Your Grace, the Duke is not well. He drinks too much and sleeps too little, and yesterday I found him standing outside your chamber door at 3 in the morning, just standing there as though he wanted to knock but could not make himself do it." And Charlotte felt her heart crack a little further, because even now, even knowing she was leaving, some foolish part of her wanted to go to him, to demand he let her in, to beat against the walls he had built until they crumbled, or she did. But she hardened herself against that impulse, against the compassion that had kept her trapped in hope for so many months, and she told Mrs. Ashford gently that the Duke's troubles were his own to resolve, that she could not continue to damage herself trying to reach someone who refused to be reached, and she saw the understanding and the sorrow in the housekeeper's eyes, saw that Mrs. Ashford knew she was preparing to leave, and could not argue against it, though it clearly broke her heart, because everyone at Thornwood had witnessed the slow dissolution of a marriage that had never been given a chance to begin, and they could not blame their mistress for finally choosing herself over the ghost of a relationship that existed only in the most technical sense. Charlotte set her departure for the day after Christmas, giving herself one final holiday at Thornwood, because tradition demanded the Duke and Duchess host the annual Christmas ball, and she would fulfill that final duty before she left, would play her role one last time with grace and dignity, would give Sebastian and society no cause to fault her behavior, even as she prepared to walk away from the gilded cage that her marriage had become. And at night she lay in her bed, listening to the wind howl around Thornwood's towers, and wondered if Sebastian was standing outside her door again, wondered if he felt even a fraction of the devastation that she carried like stones in her chest, wondered if when she was gone he would feel relief or regret, or simply nothing at all, the blessed absence of obligation finally restored. The ballroom at Thornwood blazed with 1,000 candles on the night of the Christmas ball, their light catching on garlands of evergreen and holly that draped the walls and transformed the usually austere space into something almost magical, and Charlotte stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gown of midnight blue silk that her mother had sent from London. The bodice embroidered with silver thread that caught the light like starlight on water, her dark hair swept up to expose the elegant line of her neck and the diamonds that had belonged to Sebastian's mother, glittering at her throat. A last performance of the role she had tried so hard to inhabit, a final gift to Thornwood before she left it forever. She descended the stairs with perfect grace, aware of the guests gathering below, aware of the musicians tuning their instruments, aware most of all of Sebastian standing near the hearth in his formal black evening clothes, looking like some dark prince from a fairy story. And when his eyes found her on the stairs, she saw him go absolutely still, saw something flare in his face that might have been anguish or longing or both, saw his hand tighten around the glass he held until she thought the crystal might shatter, and she forced herself to look away, to greet the guests with warmth and charm, to play the gracious Duchess one final time, even as her heart felt like lead in her chest. The evening progressed with excruciating slowness, each moment stretching like honey, and Charlotte danced with elderly Lord Morrison and young Mr. Blackwood and cheerful Sir Peter, laughing at their jokes and maintaining her composure, while Sebastian watched from the edges of the room with an expression that grew darker as the hours passed, and she wondered what he was thinking, whether he knew she was leaving, whether he cared, or whether this was simply more of the possessive territorial instinct that had driven him to send Edmund away, the desire to keep what was his, even if he had no intention of valuing it. When Sebastian finally approached her as midnight neared, requesting the next dance with stiff formality. She could not refuse without causing a scene, and so she placed her gloved hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor. And when the waltz began and his arm came around her waist, she felt the shock of contact after so many months of careful distance, felt the heat of his body through the layers of silk and wool, felt her own treacherous heart leap at his nearness, even as her mind remained firm in its resolution to leave. They moved through the dance in silence at first, their bodies remembering a synchronicity that their hearts had never achieved, and Charlotte kept her eyes fixed on his cravat rather than meeting his gaze, afraid of what she might see there, afraid of her own weakness, and his hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist, as though he could feel her slipping away and was trying to hold on, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded almost like desperation. "You look beautiful tonight," he said quietly, the words for her alone beneath the swell of music. "You have always been beautiful, Charlotte, even when I pretended not to see it, even when I tried to convince myself that indifference was protection." And she did look up then, startled by the admission, and found his face closer than she had realized, found his eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath, and for a moment she thought he might say more, might finally give her the words she had waited months to hear. But then the music ended, and he released her with visible reluctance, bowing formally as society demanded, and she curtsied and turned away before he could see the tears gathering in her eyes, and she made her excuses to the remaining guests and fled to her chambers, leaving Sebastian standing alone on the ballroom floor, looking after her like a man watching his salvation walk away. Sebastian stood alone in his study as the last carriages departed down Thornwood's Drive, their lanterns disappearing into the winter darkness like dying stars, and he moved to the sideboard with the deliberate care of a man who knew he was already half drunk and poured another measure of brandy anyway, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight and thinking that it glowed almost the same shade as Charlotte's eyes when she was angry, when she was alive with passion rather than dead with resignation. And God, the way she had looked tonight, descending those stairs like some celestial being, come to torment him with visions of what he could have had if he were a better man, a braver man, a man not so thoroughly ruined by the sins of his father and the scars of his own cowardice. He had seen it in her face during their dance, the finality, the goodbye written in every careful smile and polite word, and he had felt the distance between them like a physical thing even as he held her in his arms, had felt her slipping away with every turn of the waltz. And when she had fled the ballroom, he had wanted to follow, had taken 3 steps after her before pride and fear had frozen him in place once more, and now he stood in this damned study that had become his sanctuary and his prison, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence that meant nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the woman sleeping or perhaps not sleeping 3 corridors away. Upstairs in her chamber, Charlotte sat at her writing desk with tears streaming down her face, penning a letter she had rewritten a dozen times already, trying to find words that would explain without accusation, that would grant understanding without blame, trying to make Sebastian comprehend that she was leaving not because she did not care, but because she cared too much, because loving someone who held himself so carefully apart was slowly killing something essential in her soul. And she wrote, "I cannot continue to live as a ghost in my own life, haunting the corridors of a house that has never been a home, married to a man who cannot bear to truly see me." And the ink blurred beneath her tears, but she pressed on, determined to leave him with honesty if nothing else, to gift him with the vulnerability he had never been willing to show her. The knock on Sebastian's study door came near midnight. Missus Ashford entering without waiting for permission, as was her privilege earned through 40 years of service to the Thornwood family, and she looked at him with such profound disappointment that he felt it like a lash, and she said quietly, "Your Grace, I have served your family since before you were born. I watched your father destroy your mother with his coldness and his cruelty, and I swore I would speak if I ever saw you walking the same path. And so I am speaking now. The Duchess is leaving. She has already packed her belongings, and if you let her go, you will spend the rest of your life in this study, drinking yourself to death and regretting that you inherited your father's cowardice along with his title." Sebastian's glass stopped halfway to his lips, the words hitting him like physical blows, and he wanted to deny it, wanted to rage at the presumption. But Mrs. Ashford's eyes were too knowing, too sad, and instead he found himself saying hoarsely, I am protecting her from becoming my mother, from being trapped with a man who will only disappoint her. And, Mrs. Ashford shook her head slowly and replied, No, Your Grace. You are protecting yourself from the possibility of being hurt again, and in doing so you have guaranteed the very outcome you feared most. You have created the cold, loveless marriage your parents endured, and your wife is doing what your mother never had the courage to do. She is choosing to save herself rather than slowly wither away in the frost of your indifference. The housekeeper departed then, leaving Sebastian alone with truths he could no longer avoid, and he crossed to his desk and pulled open the locked drawer where he kept his father's journal, that terrible chronicle of a marriage destroyed by pride and fear and the inability to be vulnerable, and he read the final entry dated just before his father's death. I loved her. I loved Margaret from the first moment, but I could never make myself say it, could never risk giving her that power over me, and now she is gone, and I am left with nothing but regret and the knowledge that I destroyed the only thing worth having because I was too much a coward to fight for it. Sebastian closed the journal with shaking hands, seeing himself reflected in those bitter words with terrible clarity, recognizing that he was indeed becoming his father, that in his determination to avoid his father's mistakes, he had walked directly into them, that the walls he had built to protect himself had simply created another version of the same tragedy, and the recognition broke something open in his chest, some calcified mass of fear and pride that had been hardening around his heart for years, and he thought of Charlotte upstairs writing her farewell, thought of losing her forever, thought of spending the next 40 years alone in this study with nothing but brandy and regret for company, and he knew, finally knew with absolute certainty, that he had to risk everything, had to make himself vulnerable, had to fight for her, even if fighting meant exposing every wounded, broken part of himself to possible rejection, because living without her was no longer an option he could endure. And somewhere in the depths of that long night, as the fire burned down to embers and the sky began to lighten toward a grey winter dawn, Sebastian made his decision, and it was not courage exactly that drove him, but rather the greater fear that silence would cost him more than speech ever could. And he rose from his chair with the determination of a man preparing for battle, knowing that the war he needed to win was against himself, against every instinct that told him to protect and hide and keep his distance. And he went to find the keys to every door in Thornwood, because if Charlotte would not stay willingly, if she had given up on him as he deserved, then he would lock every door between them and make her listen, would refuse to let her leave until he had finally told her the truth, even if that truth damned him, even if vulnerability destroyed him, because he had already tried pride and distance and self-protection, and they had brought him nothing but this desperate, desolate moment when everything he wanted was preparing to walk away. Charlotte woke with the grey winter dawn to find her trunks already packed, her farewell letter sealed and addressed, the weight of her decision settled like stones in her chest, and she rose and dressed in her travelling clothes with hands that trembled only slightly, telling herself that she was choosing survival rather than accepting defeat, that there was no shame in walking away from a marriage that existed only on paper, that she had tried everything humanly possible to reach the man who bore her name but refused her heart, and she moved through her morning ablutions with mechanical precision, each gesture a small act of will against the part of her that whispered she should stay, should try harder, should wait longer. But she had waited through 4 seasons already, and nothing had changed except the depth of her loneliness. And so when she reached for the door handle of her chamber at 7:30, with her gloves on and her resolve firmly in place, the discovery that the door would not open came as such a shock that for a moment she simply stood there pulling uselessly at the handle, thinking perhaps it had stuck or swollen with the winter damp, until she heard the scrape of a key in the lock from the outside, and understanding dawned with the cold clarity of winter light. "Charlotte," came Sebastian's voice through the heavy oak, rough and sleep-deprived and utterly determined. "We must talk." And she stepped back from the door as though it had burned her, anger and disbelief flooding through her in equal measure, and she called out with all the fury of 9 months of patient suffering, "You have locked me in? You dare to imprison me in my own chamber?" And there was a long pause before he answered, his voice closer now as though he had pressed himself against the door. "I have locked every door in this wing, every exit, every passage, because you would not listen before and you will not stay willingly, and I will not let you leave, without hearing what I have spent 9 months, being too much a coward to say, and Charlotte felt something dangerous rising in her chest, something that was part rage and part desperate hope and part sheer astonishment at the audacity of the man who had ignored her for 4 seasons, and now thought he could simply cage her into listening to whatever belated confession his conscience had produced in the small hours of the morning. She crossed to the door and struck it once with her open palm, the sound sharp and accusing in the quiet corridor, and she said with ice in her voice that masked the chaos underneath, "This is madness, Sebastian. This is the act of a desperate man, not a duke, not a husband, and if you had anything worth saying, you would not need to trap me to make me hear it." And she heard him make a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, and he replied with brutal honesty, "You are absolutely right. It is madness. It is desperation. It is the final act of a man who has already lost everything that matters through his own damned pride and fear. And I know I have no right to ask you to listen, no right to keep you here, no right to any consideration whatsoever after the way I have treated you. But Charlotte, I am asking anyway. I am begging, and I will stand outside this door for as long as it takes. I will camp in this corridor until you grant me an audience, because I will not lose you without a fight. I will not let you walk away believing that I did not care, that I did not see you, that these 9 months of silence meant indifference rather than cowardice, and you can rage at me through this door and curse my name and tell me you hate me. But you will hear the truth first, even if the truth damns me forever in your eyes, even if it changes nothing, because you deserve at least that much. You deserve to know that you were never invisible, never unwanted, never anything less than extraordinary, and my failure to show you that is the greatest regret of my miserable existence." Charlotte stood frozen on her side of the locked door, her hand still resting against the oak where she had struck it, and she felt something shifting inside her chest, some glacier of frozen hope beginning to crack and splinter, because in 9 months of marriage, Sebastian had never spoken to her with such raw desperation, had never revealed even a fraction of the emotion that now poured through the barrier between them, like water through a failing dam, and she closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the door and said quietly, "Then speak, Sebastian. Say what you have locked me in here to hear." And there was a long moment of silence before his voice came again, rougher now, stripped of every aristocratic polish, and he said, "I loved you from the first month, Charlotte. I loved you when you stood in the morning room, arguing with the housekeeper about which curtains to replace. When you walked the gardens in April with mud on your hem because you had been helping the gardeners plant the roses. When you sat across from me at dinner, making polite conversation about absolutely nothing, while I wanted to tell you everything and could not make myself speak. I loved you, and it terrified me, because the last time I allowed myself to love someone, she used it as a weapon. She took my young heart and destroyed it systematically for sport, and before that I watched my father love my mother with a desperate possessiveness that turned toxic and killed them both slowly over decades, and I swore I would never be that vulnerable again, would never give anyone that kind of power over me, would never repeat the mistakes that seemed to run in my blood like a hereditary disease, and so I held myself apart from you, even though every moment of distance was agony, even though I noticed everything, the way you bite your lower lip when you are concentrating, the way you hum while you arrange flowers, the way your entire face transforms when you smile genuinely, rather than performing the social pleasantries expected of a duchess. And I treasured every small glimpse of you while simultaneously building higher walls to keep you out, telling myself I was protecting us both when in truth I was simply being a coward, choosing the certainty of loneliness over the risk of heartbreak. And Charlotte, I watched you wither over these months. I saw the light dim in your eyes and the hope fade from your expression, and I told myself it was necessary, that distance was kindness, that you would be safer with a cold husband than a vulnerable one. But last night when you descended those stairs in that gown looking like every dream I had denied myself, when we danced, and I held you in my arms and felt you already gone from me, already resigned to leaving, I understood finally that I had created exactly what I feared most. I had built my father's marriage, cold and lonely, and slowly killing us both. And Mrs. Ashford came to me after you left, and she said I was choosing my father's cowardice, and she was right. God help me, she was right. And I sat in my study reading his journal, where he confessed that he loved my mother, but could never say it. that fear and pride destroyed the only thing worth having, and I saw myself in those bitter regrets with such clarity that I could no longer hide from what I had become. And so I am here, Charlotte, standing outside your door and risking everything, telling you that I love you desperately and have loved you almost from the beginning, that every moment of silence was a lie I told to protect my coward's heart, that you have been seen and wanted and cherished even when I was too damaged and afraid to show you. And I know this confession changes nothing. I know that locking you in here is unconscionable, and that 9 months of coldness cannot be erased by one morning's desperate honesty. But I needed you to know, I needed you to understand that my cruelty came from fear rather than indifference, that you were never lacking, never insufficient, never anything but extraordinary. And if you still choose to leave after hearing this, then I will unlock these doors and let you go. But Charlotte, I am begging you to stay. I am begging for a chance to be the husband I should have been from the first, to love you openly rather than in terrified silence, to build something real rather than hiding behind the excuse of protection. And I know I have no right to ask for your trust after shattering it so thoroughly, but I am asking anyway because the alternative is losing you, and I have discovered that I am more afraid of that than I am of vulnerability, more afraid of your absence than of your potential to hurt me. And so here I am, finally, completely exposed and waiting for your judgment, waiting to learn whether my confession has come too late, whether 9 months of distance has killed whatever hope you might have harbored, whether you can ever forgive a man who loved you but lacked the courage to show it until the moment you prepared to walk away. Charlotte stood on her side of the door with tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed flat against the wood as though she could feel his presence through it. And she heard in his words every lonely dinner she had endured, every silent breakfast, every moment she had glimpsed something in his expression before he shuttered it away, and she understood suddenly that she had not been alone in her suffering, that he had been equally imprisoned by the walls he built, and she said with her voice breaking, "Then open the door. Sebastian, if you truly mean these words, then open this door and face me." And there was a terrible pause before he replied hoarsely, "I cannot, not yet, because if I open it now you will leave out of anger at being caged, and I will not blame you, but I will lose you, and so I am keeping it locked until you promise to stay, until you tell me there is still some chance for us, until you say that my confession has not come so late that your heart has turned entirely to stone against me. And I know this makes me a monster. I know I am manipulating you through imprisonment when I should be winning you through worthiness. But Charlotte, I am not a good man. I have never been a good man. I am my father's son with all the damage that implies, and the only honest thing I can offer you is this desperate truth. I love you, and I will fight for you with whatever weapons I have, even if those weapons are dishonorable, even if history judges me a villain for locking you in this chamber, because I have already tried honor and distance and noble self-sacrifice, and they brought me nothing but this moment of loss. And I would rather be condemned for fighting than regret forever that I let you go without exhausting every possibility, without making you understand that you are leaving a man who loves you rather than one who does not care." Charlotte stood with her back pressed against the locked door, her mind churning through everything Sebastian had confessed, and she felt the anger warring with something more dangerous understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a pain that mirrored her own, and she closed her eyes and thought about the audacity of a man who had ignored her for 9 months, now demanding her promise through a locked door, who had wounded her daily through silence and distance, and now expected forgiveness because he had finally found the courage to speak. And the rational part of her mind insisted that this was manipulation, that a man who truly loved her would not cage her like a bird, to force her compliance, that she should refuse on principle and wait until he exhausted himself and unlocked the door in defeat. But even as she thought these things, she remembered the small moments she had treasured over the long months, the way she had sometimes caught him watching her when he thought she would not notice, the time she had found the book she mentioned wanting on her writing desk with no note attached, the morning after she had been ill when she discovered he had sat outside her door all night, though he never acknowledged it, the way his hands had trembled almost imperceptibly when they danced last night, as though touching her caused him physical pain, and she understood suddenly that she had not been alone in her suffering, that he had been equally imprisoned by the walls he built between them, perhaps more so because he had constructed those walls himself, knowing what they cost. She moved away from the door and crossed to the window where winter light fell pale across the floorboards, and she looked out at the frozen gardens where she had planted roses in the spring with hands that trembled with hope. She barely admitted even to herself, and she thought about the woman who had arrived at Thornwood 9 months ago, expecting duty but secretly hoping for something more. And she acknowledged with brutal honesty that despite everything, despite the loneliness and the hurt and the slowly dying hope, she had fallen in love with the cold Duke who would not speak to her, had loved him for his dedication to his tenants and his unexpected kindness to the servants, and the loneliness she glimpsed in him that matched her own. And she had been preparing to leave, not because she did not love him, but because loving someone who would not love her back was slowly destroying her, and now he stood on the other side of that locked door, offering everything she had wanted. And she felt terrified because wanting something and having it offered were entirely different matters, because hope deferred had made her heart cautious, because she did not know if she could survive being vulnerable with him, only to have him retreat again into his fortress of fear. "Sebastian," she said quietly, and she heard him shift on the other side of the door as though her voice had struck him physically. And she continued with her own voice stripped of pretense, "I have loved you for months. I loved you when you would not look at me across the dinner table, when you passed me in corridors as though I were a ghost, when you maintained such perfect distance that I began to question whether I was real or simply some invisible presence haunting Thornwood's halls, and I stayed through spring and summer and autumn, hoping that somehow I could reach you, that patience and persistence would eventually breach whatever walls you had built. But Sebastian, loving you was killing me. It was turning me into a shadow, and I was leaving not because I wanted to, but because I had to choose survival over hope. And now you offer me everything I wanted, when I have finally found the strength to walk away. And you ask me to trust that this transformation is real, that you will not wake tomorrow, and decide that vulnerability is too dangerous, and retreat back into silence. And how can I believe that? How can I risk my heart again when you have been so careful to reject it for 9 months? She heard him make a sound of anguish, and he said hoarsely, "You cannot be certain, Charlotte. I cannot promise that I will not struggle with fear, that there will not be moments when I want to retreat into old patterns, because I am my father's son, and this damage runs deep. But I can promise that I will fight those instincts, that I will choose vulnerability even when it terrifies me, that I will speak even when silence seems safer. And I know that promises from a man who has broken every unspoken vow of marriage mean nothing, but I am offering them anyway because they are all I have. And Charlotte, if you promise to stay, I promise to spend every day earning that trust, proving that this morning's confession is not momentary desperation but permanent transformation. And perhaps it will take months or years before you believe me fully. But I will wait, I will work, I will love you openly and honestly until you either accept that it is real or decide that the risk is too great, and I will accept whatever timeline you need, because having you present but cautious is infinitely preferable to losing you entirely." Charlotte pressed her hand flat against the door again and whispered, "I promise, Sebastian, I promise to stay, not because I trust completely, but because I love you enough to try, because I recognize in your desperate confession the same fear and longing that has haunted me, because I understand that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is risk our hearts even when the outcome is uncertain." And she heard the key turn in the lock with a sound like a held breath, releasing. The door opened slowly, as though Sebastian feared what he would find on the other side, and when Charlotte saw him standing in the corridor, she understood immediately that he had not slept, that he had perhaps not slept in days, because his face was haggard with exhaustion, and stubble shadowed his jaw, and his cravat hung loose and wrinkled as though he had clutched at it repeatedly, and his eyes, those grey eyes that had been so carefully shuttered for 9 months, were red-rimmed and raw, with an emotion so naked that she felt her breath catch in her throat, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other across the threshold that had separated them physically for less than an hour, but emotionally for their entire marriage. And Charlotte knew that her own face bore similar evidence of the night's devastation, that her eyes were swollen from crying, and her hair had come partially loose from its pins, and the morning dress she had put on for traveling was already wrinkled from where she had pressed herself against the door, and there was something terrifying and exhilarating about being seen so completely without artifice or protection, about standing before each other stripped of every social grace and aristocratic composure, And Sebastian took one hesitant step forward and then stopped, as though uncertain whether he had permission to enter her space. This man who owned the entire estate and could command anything within it, but who now waited for invitation like a supplicant. And Charlotte felt something crack open inside her chest, some final wall crumbling, because his restraint in this moment, after the desperation of locking her in, spoke more clearly than any words about his genuine remorse. And she took a step toward him, and then another, and she saw his hands trembling at his sides, saw him clench them into fists as though to control the tremor. And when she was close enough to touch him, she raised her hand slowly and placed it against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering beneath her palm. And he made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob and covered her hand with his own. And his fingers were cold, despite the warmth of the corridor, and she realized that he had been standing outside her door for hours, that he had perhaps stood there all night waiting for her response. And she said quietly, "I am still angry with you, Sebastian. I want you to understand that I am furious that you locked me in, that you manipulated me when you should have trusted me, that you made me feel powerless when I had finally found the strength to choose myself." And he nodded immediately and said hoarsely, "I know. You have every right to your anger. I will accept whatever rage you need to express because I deserve it." And she continued, "But I also understand why you did it. I understand the desperation that drives someone to unconscionable actions when they are losing everything that matters. And Sebastian, I need you to promise me something." And he said immediately, "Anything." And she said, "Promise me that you will never lock me in again, that no matter how afraid you become, you will face me openly rather than caging me. Because I cannot build a life with someone who traps me when he is frightened, even if I understand the fear." And he raised his free hand slowly, as though asking permission. And when she did not flinch away, he cupped her face with a gentleness that belied the size and strength of his hand. And he said, "I promise, Charlotte, I swear on whatever honor I have left, that I will never imprison you again, that I will fight my fears with honesty rather than control." And she searched his face and saw sincerity written in every exhausted line, and she whispered, "Then I forgive you, not completely, not yet, but enough to begin, enough to try." And he closed his eyes, and a tear escaped down his cheek, and she reached up and brushed it away with her thumb, and he said brokenly, "I am sorry. I am so profoundly sorry for every moment of pain I caused you, for every silence, for every time I walked past you in corridors pretending you did not exist when you were all I could think about, for wasting 9 months when we could have been learning each other. And Charlotte, I know that saying I am sorry changes nothing. I know I must prove it through action and time, but I needed you to hear it." And she said, "I know, I do hear it." And then, after a pause, she asked with her voice barely audible, "Can you forgive me for planning to leave without telling you, for deciding you were unreachable without giving you the chance to prove otherwise?" And he shook his head immediately and said, "There is nothing to forgive. You were protecting yourself from further hurt. You were choosing survival. And Charlotte, I would have done the same in your position. Any rational person would have left me months ago." And she smiled slightly through her tears and said, "Then perhaps we are both irrational." And he returned her smile with such tentative hope that it made her heart ache. And he said quietly, "May I kiss you, Charlotte? Truly kiss you. Not the perfunctory touch we shared at our wedding, but something real." And she nodded and rose slightly on her toes, and his arms came around her with careful reverence, as though she were something precious and breakable. And when his lips met hers, it was gentle at first, questioning, and then as she responded, the kiss deepened into something that held 9 months of longing and loneliness and love that had been denied expression, and Charlotte felt herself melting against him, felt her body recognizing what her mind had known for months, that this man was her husband, in truth, now, and not merely in law, that they were finally beginning the marriage that should have started the day they spoke their vows. And when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily, and Sebastian rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "Ask me again in a year." And she understood that he was repeating her earlier words, accepting the timeline she needed, acknowledging that forgiveness and trust must be earned through sustained action rather than granted immediately. And she said softly, "I will. And Sebastian, I hope your answer will be yes." The weeks that followed the locked door passed with a tentative quality, as though both Charlotte and Sebastian were learning a new language together, one built on honesty rather than silence, on presence rather than distance, and the winter that had seemed so cruel and endless began to soften almost imperceptibly as January gave way to February, and the first hints of spring touched the frozen grounds of Thornwood, and Charlotte found herself navigating this strange new marriage with equal parts hope and caution, watching Sebastian carefully for signs that he might retreat back into old patterns, while simultaneously trying to open herself to the vulnerability that genuine partnership required. They began taking breakfast together, a small change that nevertheless felt monumental after 9 months of separate meals, and at first the mornings were marked by awkward silences and careful politeness, but gradually Sebastian began to share his plans for the day, asking Charlotte's opinion on estate matters with genuine interest rather than perfunctory courtesy, and she found herself telling him about the household decisions she faced, the improvements she wanted to make, the concerns Mrs. Ashford had raised about the tenant cottages, and these mundane conversations felt more intimate than any grand romantic gesture, because they represented the daily choosing of partnership over isolation. Sebastian was learning, Charlotte observed, to fight his instinct toward withdrawal, and she could see the effort it cost him when something troubled him, and instead of disappearing into his study for hours, he would seek her out and say with visible difficulty, "I find myself disturbed by the news from London," or "I am worried about the Northfields," and she understood that each of these small offerings was an act of courage, a deliberate choice to share his internal landscape rather than guard it jealously, and she reciprocated by being honest about her own struggles, telling him when she felt uncertain about her role as Duchess, when she missed her family, when something he said or did triggered the remembered pain of those 9 months of silence, and he would listen with such focused attention that she knew he was cataloguing every word, determined not to wound her inadvertently through carelessness. They walked together in the afternoons when weather permitted, following the same paths Charlotte had traversed alone for months. But now Sebastian pointed out features of the estate she had not noticed, telling her stories about his childhood, about the tree he had climbed and fallen from, about the stream where he had learned to fish, about his mother who had loved Thornwood with a fierce devotion that her unhappy marriage could not diminish. And Charlotte saw how these revelations cost him, how he was systematically dismantling the fortress he had built around his past, offering her pieces of himself like gifts, and she treasured each one, storing them carefully in her heart, understanding that trust was being built incrementally through these accumulated moments of vulnerability. The physical dimension of their marriage developed slowly, with a gentleness that surprised Charlotte, given the intensity of that first kiss. But Sebastian seemed determined not to rush her, and their progression from tentative touches to deeper intimacy felt natural and earned. Each step forward marked by wordless questions and permissions, and Charlotte found herself grateful for his patience, even as her own desire grew, because she needed to know that he wanted her not just physically, but wholly, that this new connection encompassed every dimension of partnership. And when they finally came together fully, it was on a night in late February, when snow fell softly against the windows, and Sebastian had built a fire in her chamber, and they had been talking for hours about nothing and everything, and afterwards, as she lay in his arms, listening to his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, she thought about how different this tenderness was from the cold formality of their wedding night, how transformation was possible even when it seemed impossible, how patient hope could be rewarded beyond measure. As March arrived and the first green shoots appeared in the frozen gardens, Charlotte stood at her window one morning and watched Sebastian directing the groundskeeper about preparations for spring planting, and she saw him gesture toward the plot where she had planted roses the previous year, saw him giving careful instructions about their care, and she understood that he was tending not just flowers, but the hope she had planted when hope seemed futile. And when he looked up and caught her watching, he smiled, that genuine, unguarded smile she had seen so rarely, and she smiled back and thought about how far they had traveled from that terrible morning when he had locked her door, and she knew they had farther yet to go. That building trust would take more than weeks or even months. But standing there in the growing light of early spring, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt certain that they would make it, that this fragile new beginning would strengthen into something lasting and true. Spring returned to Thornwood on the exact anniversary of Charlotte's arrival, and she stood in the garden on that morning in late March, watching the roses she had planted a year earlier bloom in a riot of pink and cream. their petals unfurling in the warm sunlight, as though celebrating their own resurrection, and she thought about how impossible this moment would have seemed during those dark months when she had knelt in the dirt, planting hope she did not truly believe would flourish. And Sebastian found her there among the flowers with tears on her cheeks, and he came to her immediately with concern written across his face, and she smiled and said, "They bloomed. Sebastian, they actually bloomed." And he pulled her close and said quietly, "Of course they did. You planted them with such care. How could they do anything but thrive?" And she leaned against him, thinking about all the things that had bloomed in the past year, not just roses, but trust and intimacy and love that had been given space and patience to grow, and Thornwood itself had transformed from the cold fortress she had entered 12 months ago into something that finally felt like home, because Sebastian had systematically opened all the rooms that had been closed, had brought light and warmth into spaces that had been dark and shuttered, had filled the halls with music and laughter instead of silence, and the servants moved through the estate with lighter steps now, and Mrs. Ashford had confided to Charlotte just last week that she had not seen the Duke so happy since he was a boy, and Charlotte treasured that observation because she could see the truth of it in Sebastian's face, in the way he smiled readily now, in the way he reached for her hand without thinking, in the way he had learned to be present in his own life rather than hiding from it. That afternoon they walked together through the grounds, as had become their custom, and Sebastian showed her his plans for expanding the gardens, for creating a maze near the south lawn, for building a small pavilion where they might take tea in summer, and Charlotte listened to his enthusiasm and felt her own growing excitement about these projects, about building a future together rather than merely enduring a present, and she thought about the secret she had been carrying for 3 weeks, the knowledge that had filled her with equal parts joy and terror, and she knew she needed to tell him, but the words felt enormous and world-changing. And finally, as they stood beside the fountain at the garden center, she said, "Sebastian, I have something to tell you, and I am not entirely certain how you will receive it." And he turned to her immediately with concern and said, "Charlotte, you know you can tell me anything. Whatever it is, we will face it together." And she took his hands in hers and said simply, "I am with child, Sebastian. We are going to have a baby." And she watched his face cycle through shock and disbelief, and then a joy so pure and unguarded that it made her breath catch. And then just as quickly she saw fear cloud his expression, saw his hands begin to tremble in hers, and he said hoarsely, "A child. We are truly, Charlotte. I am terrified." And she squeezed his hands and said, "I know, so am I. But we will learn together. We will be better than what we came from." And he pulled her into his arms and held her as though she were infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. And he said against her hair, "My father was cruel, and my mother was broken by her marriage, and I have no model for how to be a good parent. What if I fail our child the way I nearly failed you?" And Charlotte drew back enough to look into his face and said firmly, "You will not fail, because you are aware of the dangers, because you have learned to face your fears instead of running from them, because, Sebastian, you have spent this entire year proving that you can change, that you can choose love over fear, and our child will know a father who is present and engaged and honest, a father who makes mistakes but acknowledges them, who is human rather than distant and perfect." And she saw tears in his eyes, and he said, "How did I become so fortunate as to have you, Charlotte? How did I nearly throw away the greatest gift I have ever been given?" And she smiled and said, "You locked me in until I agreed to stay, remember?" And he laughed through his tears and said, "My worst moment and my best decision." And she said, "Come, I want to do something." And she led him to the small chapel on the estate grounds, the same chapel where they had spoken their vows a year ago in that cold, formal ceremony. And she said, "I want to renew our vows, Sebastian, not with witnesses and society watching, but just the two of us, speaking promises we actually mean this time, promises about the marriage we are building rather than the arrangement we were given." And he nodded immediately, and they stood before the simple altar holding hands, and Sebastian said, "I vow to be honest with you, even when honesty is difficult, to share my fears rather than hide them, to be present in our life together, to never again lock doors between us, to be a true partner and husband, to love you and our child with everything I am." And Charlotte said with her voice thick with emotion, "I vow to have patience with your struggles, to tell you when I am hurt rather than suffer in silence, to build this life alongside you as an equal, to trust in your transformation, to love you through difficulties and joys, to be honest and present and true. And they sealed these new vows with a kiss that felt more binding than any words spoken a year ago. And when they emerged from the chapel into the golden afternoon light, Charlotte felt as though they had finally, truly married each other, that everything before this moment had been prologue, and now their real story was beginning. 5 years had passed since that December morning, when Sebastian had locked Charlotte's door in desperate determination not to lose her, and Thornwood had transformed so completely that visitors who remembered its former coldness barely recognized the estate that now thrived under the care of its Duke and Duchess. And on this particular afternoon in late spring, Charlotte stood in the rose garden watching her 3 children play among the flowers that had multiplied and spread until they covered entire sections of the grounds in cascades of pink and cream and deep crimson, and her eldest daughter Amelia, who was 4 years old and possessed her father's dark hair and serious grey eyes, was showing her younger brother Thomas how to smell the roses without getting pricked by thorns, while baby Catherine slept peacefully in her pram beneath the shade of an old oak tree, and Charlotte felt her heart swell with a contentment so profound it sometimes frightened her, because she remembered too well what it felt like to live without hope, to move through days marked only by loneliness and duty, and she knew that every moment of this happiness had been earned through patience and courage and the willingness to be vulnerable, even when vulnerability felt dangerous. She heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to see Sebastian approaching, with his jacket discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking nothing like the cold, distant Duke who had barely acknowledged her existence 6 years ago, and everything like the man he had become through deliberate daily choices to be present and engaged and honest. And Amelia spotted him immediately and ran toward him shouting, "Papa!" with such joy that Charlotte saw Sebastian's face transform with that unguarded smile she had learned to treasure, and he scooped their daughter up and spun her around, while Thomas toddled over demanding equal attention, and Sebastian managed to lift both children at once, making them shriek with laughter. And Charlotte watched this scene, thinking about how terrified Sebastian had been when she first told him she was pregnant, how he had confessed his fear of repeating his father's mistakes, and how he had proven through 5 years of devoted fatherhood that awareness of our wounds could prevent us from inflicting them on others, that we were not doomed to repeat the patterns we inherited, that love and intentionality could break even the strongest curses. Sebastian set the children down and sent them back to their play before coming to stand beside Charlotte, and he slipped his arm around her waist in a gesture so natural and automatic that she knew he was not even conscious of doing it. And he said, "I was in the library looking over the accounts, and I could hear their laughter all the way from here, and I thought about how silent this house used to be, how I used silence as a weapon and a shield, and I had to come find you all, had to be part of this noise and chaos and life." And Charlotte leaned against him and said, "Do you ever regret it, Sebastian, the loss of your ordered, quiet existence?" And he laughed and said, "Every single day, I thank God that you did not leave that morning, that I found the courage to lock those doors, even though it was possibly the most manipulative thing I have ever done, because, Charlotte, you saved me from a life that was not really living. You and these children have given me everything I did not know I needed." And she turned in his arms to face him and said, "We saved each other, I think, because I was willing to settle for duty and obligation. I was prepared to live a half-life, and you forced both of us to demand more, to fight for something real." And he kissed her forehead and said, "I still apologize too much, according to you." And she smiled and said, "You do. But I have learned that it comes from genuine remorse about those 9 months, and I cannot fault you for that, even though I have forgiven you 1,000 times over." And they stood together watching their children play in the garden that Charlotte had created through hope and determination. And Sebastian said quietly, "Sometimes I dream that I am back in that version of myself, cold and distant and alone, and I wake up terrified that this is the dream, that I will discover none of this is real, and then I hear you breathing beside me, or one of the children calls out, and I remember that this is real, that I get to keep this, that every day I am given another chance to choose love over fear." And Charlotte squeezed his hand and said, "You have not chosen fear in 5 years. Sebastian, at some point you must forgive yourself and accept that you have become someone new." And he nodded, though she knew this remained his greatest struggle. This belief that his transformation was fragile and temporary, that the cold duke still lurked beneath the surface, waiting to re-emerge. But she had learned that healing was not linear, that old wounds ached longest, and she had patience enough for both of them. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Sebastian called the children over, and they walked as a family back toward the house, and Charlotte looked up at Thornwood's grey stone facade and remembered arriving here 6 years ago, seeing only coldness and duty, and now those same stones seemed warm and welcoming, because she had learned that houses like hearts could be transformed by those willing to bring light into dark spaces, by those brave enough to plant hope even when hope seemed futile, by those strong enough to unlock doors that fear had sealed shut. And as they entered the great hall with its windows thrown open to the spring evening, and flowers on every surface, and the sound of children's laughter echoing off ancient walls, Charlotte thought about all the seasons that had passed, 4 seasons of silence and sorrow, and 5 years of seasons filled with love and growth, and the daily choosing of partnership over isolation. And she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, that the fortress had been transformed into a home, that the cold duke had become a devoted husband and father, that the lonely duchess had become a woman who knew her own strength and worth, and that their story, which had begun so bleakly, had become something beautiful through patience and courage, and the willingness to fight for love, even when love seemed impossible. Dear listener, you have journeyed with me through this story of Charlotte and Sebastian, through 4 seasons of silence and sorrow followed by years of hard-won happiness, and perhaps you have recognized something of yourself in their struggles. Perhaps you have known what it feels like to love someone who has built walls so high you cannot see over them, or perhaps you have been the one constructing those walls, believing that distance equals safety, that isolation protects against pain. And I tell you their story, not as a fairy tale where love conquers all through magic or fate, but as a testament to the truth that transformation requires patience and courage, and the willingness to be vulnerable, even when vulnerability feels like standing naked in a storm. Because Sebastian's walls were not built from cruelty, but from fear, from wounds inflicted long before Charlotte arrived at Thornwood's gates. And how many of us push away the very things we most desperately want, because we have learned that wanting leads to loss, that opening our hearts invites inevitable betrayal, that it is safer to feel nothing than to risk feeling everything. Charlotte could have left that December morning, could have walked away from a marriage that had brought her 9 months of loneliness and pain, and no one would have blamed her for choosing self-preservation over hope. But she stayed, not because Sebastian locked her door, though that desperate act finally broke through both their defenses, but because she recognized in his desperation the mirror of her own longing, because she understood that his coldness was armor rather than truth, because she had the courage to believe that people can change when given reason and space and patience to do so. And is that not what love requires of us in its deepest form? Not the easy passion of early romance, but the sustained choice to see the wounded person beneath the defensive behaviors, to extend grace while also maintaining our own dignity, to fight for connection while respecting that healing cannot be rushed. Their story teaches us that locked doors sometimes need to be opened from both sides simultaneously, that the person who has barricaded themselves in their fortress of fear cannot emerge until they trust that someone will be waiting on the other side, but also that we cannot wait forever in empty hallways, hoping that doors will open through our patience alone, that sometimes love requires dramatic gestures and honest confessions, and the willingness to risk rejection in pursuit of genuine connection. And yes, Sebastian's choice to lock Charlotte's door was manipulation born of desperation, but it was also the first truly honest thing he had done in their marriage, the first moment when he allowed his actions to reveal his feelings rather than concealing them behind propriety and distance, and that honesty, flawed and desperate as it was, created the opening through which real communication could finally flow. So I say to you, who perhaps love someone with walls, be patient but not passive, be understanding but not diminishing of your own needs. Know that you cannot fix another person's wounds, but you can create space for them to heal. And know also when it is time to walk away, because not every locked door will open, no matter how long you wait. And that wisdom, that knowing when to stay and when to go, comes not from formulas or rules, but from listening to your own heart and honoring your own worth. And I say to you who perhaps have built walls around your own heart, Know that those barriers you constructed to protect yourself have become a prison, that the isolation you chose as safety has transformed into suffering, that vulnerability is not weakness but the greatest courage, and that on the other side of your fear waits the possibility of connection and joy and love that makes the risk worthwhile. And yes, you may be hurt again, because love always carries that possibility, but you will certainly suffer if you choose isolation, so you must decide which pain you are willing to bear, the pain of potential loss or the pain of certain loneliness. May you find the courage to unlock the doors behind which you hide. May you extend patience to those still learning to open their own. May you plant roses even when you cannot see their blooming. May you trust that seasons change and hearts heal, and that transformation, though slow and difficult, is always possible for those brave enough to choose it. And may you know the particular joy of watching someone become who they were always meant to be when fear no longer dictates their choices. And may you rest well, dear listener, in the knowledge that your own story is still being written and that it is never too late to choose vulnerability over safety, connection over isolation, love over fear.